unfortunately, according to my friends and family back in Philadelphia, had picked up during my years here. So thankfully, my mom now cannot make fun of me for this accent during Thanksgiving dinner, which now for some reason is in November, I believe. I came here in the fall of 1998, Philly accent still intact, eager to study Ukrainian literature. And one of the courses I took in my first semester was a course in contemporary Ukrainian literature, which was taught by Professor Danylo Struk. And as was mentioned, I was one of the last students, the last graduate student of Professor Struk. To this day, I finally remember Professor Struk's lessons in contemporary Ukrainian literature. This was the only course I had the opportunity to take with him. We would sit in his corner office on Sussex Street, overlooking Fort Book, the library, and for about 2 hours, we would just discuss the experimental poetry of Husar, the plays of Yuri Tarnowski, the prose of Yuri Prochasko, among other literary works. And this, I believe, was the first time that most of this contemporary Ukrainian literature was taught as a course, and that includes Ukraine. I think this was the first time this was ever taught. Of course, there are now several courses taught, including one of mine own, in this, but I think that should be noted, that was one of the first. And I learned a lot from Professor Struk in this course. He was quick to point out which works he considered to be, well, how do you say, less than great. But then he would discuss the works he loved with this great enthusiasm, which he was able to pass on quite well. And a little anecdote, when I was to hand in my final paper for this course, it was the spring of 1999. And if anybody remembers, TTC was on strike. And I was living around Islington, Dundas area, but I had to turn my paper in. So what do? I was flying to Ukraine the next day. So what I ended up doing was walking my paper over to Professor Struk's residence in Bloor West Village. I highly recommend. It's a very satisfying way to finish a course, is to walk a paper over 40 minutes, and you worked on it for so many days, and you're walking this over and you hand it in. Sadly, that was my last contact with Professor Struk. Now, being that the only course I ever took with Professor Struk was one in contemporary Ukrainian literature, I believe that it's particularly fitting that it is also the topic of my talk today. I will be discussing the first new wave of prose works to appear in post-Soviet Ukraine in the 1990s, some of which we have discussed in the class. As was mentioned, my talk is entitled New Images of the Intellectual in Post-Soviet Ukrainian Literature. And during my talk, I'll read several excerpts of literary works. So I have a handout for you which you can refer to as we're reading them. Thank you. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union was fading from existence, a new generation of Ukrainian writers emerged to challenge inherited norms in Ukrainian culture and to explore questions of Ukrainian identity in art. The new Ukrainian prose works that were written at this time experimented with both form and with content, and they often featured Ukrainian intellectuals as chief protagonists. This was done deliberately because these writers designated these protagonists, these intellectuals, as sites where the post-Soviet Ukrainian identity would be explored. The writers who focus most on the Ukrainian intellectual in their prose and who are analyzed in my talk this evening, Volodymyr Dibrova, Konstantin Moskalets, Oksana Zabushko, Yuri Andryczyk, and Evgenia Podanenko. These writers are among those contemporary Ukrainian culture figures who are often identified with the term Visimdesiatniki, the 80s generation. Now, these writers come from different corners of Ukraine. There's quite a large age difference. The oldest one, I believe, Dibrov, was born in 1951, where Moskalets, the youngest, 1963. And this term, Visimdesiatniki, it's an inexact term. It's a lot of people, some of these writers, among some of us people, do not like this term. but it's been used quite consistently over the last 15 years, and there have been several publications published which use this term, and I'm using it today to refer to this group of people. In other words, these are people who first debuted, most of them started writing poetry, and that came out in the late 80s, thus Vysendesyatniki, but basically they were the first generation to really appear in the 90s. So all of the texts that I'm going to be talking about today were written and first published between 1990 and 2001. Never in the history of Ukrainian literature has the Ukrainian intellectual been given so much attention in literature as in the period under discussion tonight. And accordingly, among the major achievements that these writers made to Ukrainian culture is their introduction of 3 new prototypes of the Ukrainian intellectual to Ukrainian literature. And I gave them these names: the swashbuckling performer, the ambassador to the West, and the sick soul. And when using the term intellectual this evening, I should also, a couple words on that, I'm referring to creative individuals, chiefly artists, and also those, including critics and scholars, who devote their lives to the analysis and interpretation of the creative activity of such individuals. Existing studies of intellectuals have generally focused on relationships that intellectuals have with government and with society. Scholars have often offered several prototypes of the intellectual which reflect different configurations of these relationships. Just to give you a couple that have been put forth in the past, the philosopher kings. These are an exclusive group with a moral obligation to use their talents in the service of truth. Or messianic bohemians. They're members of an elite and have a vision of progress in a world in revolution. Court jesters. These are people who have a position outside the social rank, and this affords them the freedom and the duty to question authority. And Robin Hoods. Individuals who rationally research suppressed sources and outwit their opponents in debate. Now, throughout the different eras of Ukrainian literature, leading up to the appearance of the Vysendesyatniki, the intellectual as a protagonist was depicted as having shifting relations with fellow citizens and with government over the years. Just a quick review. Late 19th century Ukrainian literature, driven by the ideals of populism, was dominated by the image of a rural-oriented intellectual, a member of a more widely defined intelligentsia, who worked tirelessly to educate and improve the lot of the Ukrainian peasant, who was brutally exploited by the ruling class. Such intellectuals are best represented in the prose works of Ivan Franko and Ivan Levetsky. Early modernist writings of Olya Kobylanska, Vladimir Vinnichenko, Tanhil Krimsky, among others, distinguished themselves from their predecessors by entertaining the turn-of-the-century idea of art for art's sake, and by flirting with decadence in their writings. Prose works which increasingly featured urban settings. These writers, however, were still largely concerned with serving the narod, the Ukrainian people, often at the expense of their personal aesthetic convictions. It was this conflict, in fact, that drove the best works of this period. 1920s Ukrainian Soviet writers, Mykola Khmelyov, Yanovsky, featured highly idealistic revolutionary intellectuals protagonists who became increasingly disillusioned with their political surroundings, which they initially championed as they strove to create the all-encompassing art of the future. Later, the intellectual of Ukrainian socialist realism was depicted as a positive hero chiefly involved in fighting bourgeois nationalist sabotage of the Soviet system and in vanquishing any impediments to fulfilling that system's economic objectives. During the Khrushchev thaw, the Shestadesятniki in the 1960s generation benefited from loosening of official restraints on aesthetics and by rehabilitation of the writers of the executed Renaissance, which was the generation from the 20s, who had become especially influential on their worldview on these 1960s. The underground unofficial cultural scenes of 1970s and 1980s, which were centered